All right, so I'll start off this class like I did last one, apologizing for my voice. Not quite up to its usual place, but we'll do the best we can. In the last class, in the lecture notes, you'll see a slide that we posted announcing the times and the locations of the review sessions that the teaching fellows will have. So if you'd like to take advantage of those review sessions in preparation for next Wednesday's exam, please feel free to do so. And please remember as well that you will not need to turn in a concept sheet for next week, just as a little extra opportunity to prepare for the exam. Are there any questions about the exam that people like to ask now? Yes?
Describe the format.
Okay, describe the format. It'll be brief answers, a few definition type things like define this, that, or the other thing. But mainly it'll be brief essay type answers to questions. And in one of the previous lectures, I gave an example of an exam question from the last time I taught the class. And that's a good, and also the criteria that we did use to score that particular question. So that'll give you a pretty good idea about how we ask questions and the type of things we're looking for in the answers. Yeah, I don't want anybody to get fooled by the nature of the exam. So hopefully we've done a good job describing that. Another question? Okay, go ahead. The exam will be here. Yep. And it'll take place during the regular class time. People will always have enough time during the regular class time to answer the questions. Right now, it looks like there will be 6 questions that you'll have answered. Some of them will have different parts to them. In fact, each of them will have different parts to them, but it'll be comprised of 6 questions, and you'll get points for each question, and it'll add up to 100 points, 100 possible points. Okay, good. Let's get started. The last evening, I received an email from a student in the class who said that I might be creating some misperceptions about farmers and farming in general. And I was grateful to get that email because I'm always happy to hear from you folks about things that you think may be things I'm covering in class that may be biased, may be leave out important information, or there are things you'd like to see included that I haven't. Please let me know that, because I really appreciate that feedback. In some cases, there will be time during the class to repair the problem that you might identify, but at the very least, it's helpful for the next class I teach. So please pass along that kind of feedback. But I wanted to address that question in particular, which I think is really very important. If you look at farming in balance, it's sort of up and down sides. There's a lot to say on each side of the equation. And one thing we cannot do is to create a stereotype of what the typical farmer is like. Because a farmer can range from a person that has an acre or 2 of land and grows a lot of different crops to somebody that has thousands of acres and may not even own the farm him or herself, but just lease the land from a larger enterprise and have control over much more stuff and only raise one particular crop or one animal. And so within that wide array of farming practices, there are farmers who care deeply about the land. There are others who care less and are just in it for the profit. There are some who care deeply about the animals they raise. There are others who care less about them. There's caring, there's callousness, there's really all of this mixed into the picture. And we're talking in the last class and in this class about sustainability. And in the context of that particular issue, there are important concerns that have been raised about modern farming practices. So by definition, in the last class and this class, we're talking about some of the downsides of modern agriculture. When we talked in the Green Revolution, we talked more about the upsides of modern agriculture. And we're going to come back later in a subsequent class, and I'll have some guest lecturers come in, the folks particularly who run the Yale Sustainable Food Program. And these are individuals who are farmers. Yale has a farm that they run. There are people who interact with farmers who bring in food to the Yale dining halls. And these are a group of farmers who care very deeply about their farming practices and care deeply about the land and about the animals and things like that. So in that class, you'll get a more positive picture. So what I don't want to do is leave the impression that farming is inherently dangerous inherently bad or inherently callous, because it's not necessarily those things at all. There are those practices, and it's true that there are a lot of pressures on modern farmers to be, I mean, they have to survive in the marketplace. And those pressures make them compete with what other farmers are doing in the marketplace. And that means if their crops are yielding more because of things like pesticides and fertilizers and the like that we've talked about in class, or they're using genetically modified crops, it puts a lot of pressure on individual farmers to follow those kind of practices. Some farmers yield to all of them, some to part of them, some to none of them. It really depends on who the farmer is. So the picture is actually quite an interesting and complicated one with a lot of different things going on. And I alluded to this last time, but if you look at how the American farm has changed over the last 100 years, you see that the number of farms has gone way down. So as you can imagine, I'm sorry, I went too fast on that. The average size of the farm has gone way up. And so there are some farms that are many multiples of the average here, but the number of people that own and run small farms has gone way down. The average number of crops, as you see, has gone way down as well. And so this monoculture has created some negative consequences, but some upsides as well. So there are good and bad parts of everything. And then the number of people in the population, the percentage of the population that work on farms, has really changed dramatically. So there are up and down sides of this, and we'll talk about both in class. But again, I wanted to deal with that particular perception. All right, as we talk about food and what issues around food people care about, there are a number of them. And these terms have been used a lot in class, and they'll continue to get used. Each has definitions, some of which we talked about already. But it's interesting that different people care about different parts of these. And at the end of the class, I'll come back to how there may be some common ground that unites all of these particular interests. But today I'd like to talk just briefly about definitions of organic and sustainable and what they mean. The definition of organic is precise. It's driven by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that in response to what farmers were asking for was set a uniform standard for what it meant to be organic. And there are different parts of the whole food chain process that you see listed on the screen that have to be met if something is truly considered organic. And so it has to do with the seeds, it has to do with how the crops are grown, how the animals are raised, and how the food is processed. And if a farm meets all these criteria, then what the farm is producing can be considered organic. This is administered through something called the National Organic Program, which is run by the USDA, and the symbol that you see on the right is granted to crops that meet those criteria, and it covers those criteria that you see in the bottom of the page. So this has led to some real advances, because prior to establishing a national standard, people were using the word organic in many different ways, and consumers didn't really know what it meant. Well, now you know what it means. And so if you buy something organic in the United States and it has that USDA symbol, it means it's met those criteria on the previous slide. Sustainability is different from organic. Something can be raised sustainably but not be organic, and vice versa. So sustainable really has to do less with the crop itself or the animal itself than with the conditions under which they're raised. And so the UK Sustainable Development Commission has what I think is a nice definition. So safe, healthy, and nutritious food can meet the needs of less well-off people. So there's a social conscience part of it that's built into the definition. Provides a viable livelihood for farmers, processors, and retailers whose employees enjoy a safe and hygienic working environment, whether in the UK or overseas. Now, there are different pieces to that. There's the livelihood for farmers, so that in order for food to be sustainable, the farmer has to be sustainable. But it also talks about employees in the food system. Respects biophysical environmental limits in its production and processing while reducing energy consumption and improving the wider environment. It also respects the highest standards of animal health and welfare compatible with the production of affordable food for all sectors of society. So there's a lot built into that as well. Affordable food, animal welfare, environmental friendliness. And then finally, supports rural economies and the diversity of rural culture, in particular through an emphasis on local products that keep food miles to a minimum. The whole idea about rural economies and rural culture is very interesting. And as you can imagine, rural culture has changed a lot with the number of farms going way down, the number of people employed on farms. Rural communities have changed an awful lot. And the attractiveness of living in those communities and working in those communities changes over time depending on the economic conditions and whether farms are thriving or not. So a definition of sustainability can have a lot of different pieces to it, all affecting different parts of the food system. So let's talk about an example, and sustainable or not, modified or not, and what qualities food may have, depending on what you're paying attention to. And there was an article in New York Magazine in 2006 that I thought was quite interesting here. They gave examples of two different tomatoes. The one on the left is called the striped German tomato, raised in New Jersey. It has a relatively short shelf life unless it's refrigerated, but that harms the taste properties. And so it's usually eaten locally or shipped into Manhattan, let's say. The cost is high because you can't raise so many of them. The one on the right is a hybrid round red that's grown different parts of the country, but particularly in Florida, cost a lot less. Now, we've all had the tomato on the right. It's in a lot of different foods we eat, and you can see from the consistency in the middle there, you can almost taste what that tomato tastes like just by looking at the picture. And it's one of those things that has relatively little taste. You know, people are amazed when they grow tomatoes in their yard how wonderful they taste, or when they get locally grown things at a farmer's market compared to the kind of things that are mass produced and shipped long distances. And if you look at these two tomatoes, the striped German is grown more sustainably than the other one. Heirloom seeds are used, so it's not crossbred to create some modified version of the original tomato. It is the original tomato. The seeds are planted in a greenhouse. They're then transplanted into the field. They're harvested and trucked to the local market without much stuff going on them. The hybrid red, which is bred not for taste necessarily, but for color and consistency, because it would be great if you could have a tomato that had all the right properties. But in this case, taste yields in the breeding process to color and long shelf life so they can be transported long distances. But here's what happens. Here are all the things that happen to that tomato by the time the seed goes in the ground and it gets to you. So I'll just let you read that. So that's a lot of stuff going on with that particular tomato. And one can come to your own conclusions about whether overall this is good or bad, because the upside is that we can get tomatoes any time of the year in any part of the country. The cost is relatively low. The shelf life is long, which helps the supermarket, and there's not as much waste and spoilage. But the cost is all those things, and the impact all those things do to the environment, potentially to our health. So, you know, there's good, there's bad, as there is with any part of these sort of things. But it's interesting to look at the two tomatoes as an example. Now, one of the reasons that there's a market for this kind of thing is that it goes in so many foods. So Burger King needs slices of tomatoes that look good and uniform because they're open all year long in all parts of the country. Taco Bell is the same thing for the tomatoes that go on. So the fact that there's a market for these foods creates a market for those tomatoes. And that's how, and the only way to meet that need and meet that demand is create tomatoes with certain properties. And that's where you get the differences between an heirloom, locally grown variety and the mass-produced varieties from somewhere else. So that leads us to the discussion of genetically modified foods. We've talked about this a little bit before in the context of the Green Revolution, but there's a lot more to say about the issue. And as with anything else, there are going to be up and down sides. Now, in the past lecture, excuse me, especially pertaining to the Green Revolution, we talked about the genetic modification of foods, the great increases in yields, the development of foods with certain nutritional properties, like the golden rice and things, where there's clearly an upside of the genetic modification. Now, we're talking about genetic modification today in the context of sustainability. And so, do genetically modified foods lead to a more sustainable world or a less sustainable world? Certainly a more sustainable world if you can increase the amount of food available to the population, but there are concerns with it as well, and I'm going to talk about some of those today. This is a graphic from the U.S. Department of Agriculture showing the increase in the United States, or worldwide increase rather, of genetically modified foods going through 1999. Now it's interesting where in the world these things are grown. So these are the top 10 countries that grow genetically modified food. I'm going to show you not the first number 1, but all the other 9. And these are the countries and the number of acres. And if you add up these acres for all 9 of these countries that make up most of the top 10, it's 137 million acres. Now, as you may guess, number 1 on the list is the United States, and here's the number of acres. So the U.S. is the clear leader. It has essentially half of the world's total of planted acres of genetically modified foods. And as I mentioned earlier in a class, there's a social history to this. In the U.S., people don't care very much about this. We don't have to label genetically modified foods. Most of us don't ask whether the foods we're eating are genetically modified, and the population doesn't care. In other parts of the world, people care a lot about this, particularly in Europe. So some people have estimated that 40 to 60% of all the foods we eat in the United States have genetically modified constituents in them. If you go to a place like Europe, it's much, much different, much lower number, because people in those countries care about it. Now, the people who've written about this, the people who are concerned about it, have said it's mainly because of the muscle of the big agribusiness companies that have stifled debate in the United States and have basically won over legislators so that they don't do anything to regulate against it. Whereas in the European countries, and this is true in general, business is a less powerful force in the political system, and people do care about it. Legislators have stepped in with regulation and things, and the situation is much different than it is in the U.S. This slide shows where the genetically modified foods are around the world and what has increased in recent years. So I'm not going to pause over this too much, but if you care to go back and look at it, you'll see what's happening around the world. So just a few facts about this: number of millions of acres of it, how many countries are involved, and then again, the U.S. is half the world's total of crops. So when we talk about genetically modified foods, we talked about golden rice before, and let's talk about BT corn, because this is something that's closer to home. And BT corn is a very prominent and highly controversial genetically modified food. The BT corn it was developed to resist this particular insect that devours the corn and poses a great threat to the corn farmer's existence. And so the fact that this borer feasts on the corn so much leaves a farmer with several possibilities. One is to apply pesticides, and now the alternative is to plant BT corn, which is corn that's been developed to resist the insect itself without having to put on an external agent. And it works like this. So here's a little graphic of the corn borer eating the corn. And then there's this particular bacillus that is listed here. That's where the BT comes from right there. I'm sorry it's not a little more clear, but I'll show you this in another slide. That gene, the particular gene from this, is inserted into the crop, and then the crop develops its own expression of that gene, and then that crop can be bred, and that gene persists in the crop, and when the corn borer eats that particular corn, it dies. And so the gene, again, from this bacillus, which is toxic to the corn borer, is inserted into the corn then expresses the gene, and the corn borers consume the toxin, their stomachs rupture, and they die. So this, as you can imagine, depending on the cost, has some real advantages to the farmer and potentially to the environment, because you're not spraying pesticides on to get rid of the corn borer. Now, there are environmental concerns about the impact of the genetically modified corn, but there are some upsides too without having to spray the pesticides. So you can see a farmer makes lots of judgment calls about how to approach this kind of issue. You know, what's the worst of the two evils, what's better for my utility in the market, et cetera. And here's an example of one of those judgment calls that has to be made. Here's a slide from the University of Illinois that shows corn crops side by side, where on the left they've tried to deal with traditional insecticides to get rid of the corn borer, and on the right they've used Bt corn, and you can see a clear difference in how the corn is thriving, and of course different environmental concerns with these two things. So here are a few facts about Bt corn. Licensed for use in 1996, so it hasn't been around all that long. It's now 35% of the US corn crop and growing. The concerns about it are that it travels long distances in the ecosystem. So if that slide that I showed you before from the University of Illinois would be typical, the genetically modified corn is not, and its byproducts in the corn plant are not going to be confined to that particular field, because they'll be carried elsewhere, particularly through rainwater, flooding, and storms, into other places. And so to the extent that the genetically modified corn is having negative impacts, then it is not confined to the areas just where it's being grown. There's also concern that this kills more than the corn borer, potential allergic reactions when people consume the food. That's a controversial and not very highly studied area. And then there are always concerns about unknown effects on human beings from consuming these genetically modified foods that we just haven't discovered yet. Not enough science has been done. So that's a big question mark at the moment. So here would be an example of how this concern about the spread of the genetically modified organisms might be a problem. So you have the Bt corn over here. Through streams and floods and rainwater, the corn itself will spread downstream, sometimes quite long distances. And then there's this particular insect here, the caddisfly, which is not the target of the Bt gene, because the farmers aren't concerned about this particular insect because it's not eating the corn, whereas the corn borer is. So it kills not only the thing it's intended to kill, but other things as well. This is a common food for fish and amphibians in these streams. And so you can see how the whole ecosystem can get affected by something like this. And so when one talks about the costs and the benefits of genetically modified foods, this is the sort of thing that has to be factored into the picture. Now there's a large concern about genetically modified foods and their transfer and contamination to different parts of the environment. So here would be a hypothetical example. So here are wheat crops. And let's just say that this white line represents the property line between two farms. And one farmer A owns the property on the left and is growing wheat, and farmer B owns the property on the right and is growing wheat there. And let's say on the right it's an organic wheat, and on the left it's GMO wheat. The question is, does the farmer on the right suffer potential negative consequences from the fact that he's right next door to somebody using genetically modified wheat? And there have been lawsuits filed about this from farmers claiming contamination by nearby genetically modified crops. And so the concern here is that there's contamination from one farm to the next, or transfer of genetic material from one to the next, and that it can happen through a lot of things. Wind, water, birds, animals, and humans can transfer them. So, you know, a truck that is full of the harvested wheat from the left going down that road, and some of it blows out and the wind's blowing toward the organic wheat, you potentially have issues. Birds will transfer things, et cetera. And then the question is the livelihood of the farmer on the right affected by the one on the left? And would his crop then, when it's crossbred that through the sort of natural process of the transfer of these things, not have an organic crop any longer because it doesn't meet the non-GMO criteria that's part of the organic set of criteria for being considered organic. So these become very interesting issues. And so, again, GMOs may be good or bad, but to the extent that they have negative consequences, this is one of the concerns that people have raised. There's a book by a man named Jeffrey Smith called Seeds of Deception. And you can see from the title of the book how he feels about genetically modified foods. This is the third time I've taught this class, and in the first class, I had him come and speak to the class. And he's a very interesting, colorful, and passionate person on this topic. And he cares a lot about these sort of things. And the book is very interesting. And it's a combination of a review of the recent science on the issue, but also anecdotal things that are most interesting. So for example, he would talk about cornfields or wheat fields where flocks of birds migrating from the north to the south would stop every year, similar flocks with same number of birds and things, and feast on the fields. And then a farmer, and so then one farmer would plant genetically modified crops, the other one would keep the traditional crops. The birds would come and completely ignore or stay away from the genetically modified crops and continue to go to the traditional crops. What does that mean? Who knows? But there are all these anecdotal reports that are really very interesting in that, and those are contained in this book by Smith. Now, whether you take his message and consider it alarming or alarmist depends on your point of view. And if you think GMOs are a potentially bad thing and the concerns outweigh the benefits, his book is alarming. And there's a lot in there that would make you say, oh my God, I can't believe that's true. And then, but if you believe that the genetically modified foods are a good thing for the environment and for the economy and for farming in general, then you look at this and say that he's being selective in the information he presents. These anecdotes don't really prove anything, and he really ignores the upsides of it. So depends on your perspective here. The fact that genetically modified crops are being used in different parts of the world is made clear a lot of different ways. But I heard not too long ago this interesting NPR clip on this, and I thought I would play this for you.
Comes from the NPR shop, introducing NPR's funniest driveway moments, a 2-CD set of NPR interviews with some of the brightest stars in comedy.
So if you're into driveway moments, you're in luck.
NPR.org.
High food prices are driving governments and farmers around the world to search for tools to grow more food. Among those tools, genetic engineering. Many third world countries have banned genetically modified crops. Honduras is one country that's encouraging it. Dan Charles has this latest in our series of reports looking at the global food shortage as it's playing out in this Central American nation.
Rodolfo Rubio rips the husk off an ear of corn and shows off the gleaming rows of white kernels. There are no worms in this corn, which is quite remarkable because those worms are everywhere here in central Honduras, and Rubio hasn't sprayed anything on this field to kill them.
No, es una ventaja.
No, the only thing we need here is the seed, the fertilizer, and the herbicide.
The secret is in the corn itself. Years ago, scientists at the company Monsanto took a gene from a kind of worm-killing bacteria and inserted it into an ancestor of these corn plants. So if worms start munching on the corn, they die. Rubio doesn't have to spray insecticide the way he used to. He lifts up a corn leaf and points to another kind of insect hiding underneath.
Este es un insecto benéfico.
This is a beneficial insect that eats the worms. They are safe from this land because there aren't any insecticide residues here.
Rubio started growing Monsanto's genetically modified corn 4 years ago. He paid about $1,000 extra for enough corn seed for 30 acres. But he says this technology saves him so much time and money, he can't imagine not using it.
Por eso le digo, ¿cómo va a creer si me dice?
If someone tells me that the government wants to limit my access to technology, that's like telling me that I don't have the right to a better life or more profits. And it wants to see me sink into poverty.
But in the rest of Central America, growing this corn is against the law. Corn is more than a crop here, it's history and culture. Central America is where farmers first grew corn, thousands of years ago, and in some places you can still find an almost infinite variety of corn plants. Jacqueline Chenier, who is director of a Honduran organization that promotes small-scale organic agriculture, says bringing in unnatural genes threatens the integrity of this natural treasure.
When you come with genetically modified variety, genes cross with those other varieties, and what you have is contamination because you have a strange gene in those varieties. So they are not what they were before.
Last year, Chenier thought these arguments might be getting somewhere. The country's new Minister of Agriculture said the country might stop growing or importing genetically modified crops, often called GMOs. Then came the food crisis. Corn doubled in price. And just a few weeks ago, that same Minister of Agriculture said he now wants farmers to plant more corn, including genetically modified corn. Robert Parlberg, a professor at Wellesley College, says concern over food shortages may be shifting government policies in other countries too.
Egypt has approved GMO corn. China has just announced a large increase in its research budget for GMO food.
But it's not a big shift. Genetic engineering still isn't welcome across much of Latin America, Asia, and especially Africa.
It's been criminalized by the regulatory systems of developing countries.
Parlberg thinks that's terrible because he says this technology can help farmers, even poor farmers. Monsanto certainly thinks so. It has big plans in Honduras. Rita Perdomo, a marketing manager for the company, says Honduran farmers increased their planting of genetically modified corn this year by 50%. It's still only about 15% of the country's corn crop, though.
Por lo menos el 40 al 50% es
Hopefully, by 2012, 40 to 50% of those 500,000 acres will be planted with varieties that include biotech traits.
She thinks, as a result, Honduras' production of corn per acre will double or even triple, and the country will no longer have to depend on imported corn for tortillas and animal feed. Others scoff at this prediction. Most farmers in Honduras are poor, too poor to spend much money on corn seed or anything else that would boost their production, like fertilizer or irrigation. Even the skeptics, though, are watching events in Honduras carefully to see whether first world biotechnology can, in fact, make a difference for third world farmers. For NPR News, I'm Dan Shorms.
And you can see a chart of which countries plant genetically modified.
Okay. So this is a picture of the farmer that was interviewed here, and they talk about him holding corn that has been protected by the BT gene and corn that has not. So you can hear within this clip a lot of interesting things, but certainly the up and down sides, the concern, the fact that concern gets overridden by economic realities of the world, whether local farmers can afford to pay for the technology. A lot of things are in this picture that makes it pretty interesting and fascinating. One of the other things that I just like to point out about that particular clip, because this will come up a lot later in class, is when NPR was doing this, they got the company perspective. They got Monsanto people to weigh in on this. And you'll see very often in the way press covers issues that they want to get all sides represented. That's what they consider to be fair. And the industry is very often quoted in these sort of things. And the question is, can you trust industry in this context? Is the industry perspective a useful one to have? Well, of course, they've got a vested interest. They're not going to say it's dangerous or it has a downside, so they're going to have a sort of a biased view. And so does it make sense to even talk to industry in this context? If you're having to discuss, let's say you want to put together an expert panel on genetically modified foods and their future in the US and whether there should be regulation, restriction, whatever, do you invite industry to that meeting? Do they even become part of the picture? And the outcome of discussions varies a lot on whether industry is there as a voice or is not there as a voice. And we'll come back to this when we talk about food marketing in particular, but this issue comes up in this context as well. Okay. I've been reminded about that enough. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Okay, here we go. All right, so I'd like to turn our attention now to the issue of animal welfare. There are many people who are concerned about the modern food environment because of the effect it has on the animals that are part of that picture. And this is another example where there are extremely strong feelings about this. You have groups like PETA that are way out at one end of this in terms of concern. Some people believe strongly enough to join a group like that. Other people feel that they're way out in the extreme and not to be taken seriously. And there are lots of people in the middle who think about this animal welfare issue. And the fact is that the modern food conditions, given what people want to eat and given what the industry is producing, makes the production of large amounts of animals in small amounts of space at the least possible cost an imperative. So if we're going to have McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's putting out vast amounts of hamburgers, if we're going to have as people eating as much steak and hamburger as they are, if we're going to have as much meat in the system, as much chicken in the system, et cetera, as we have now, then that necessitates certain conditions for raising the animals. Now there are changes to some extent that allow some people to eat meat from animals that are not raised in those circumstances. So the whole idea of free-range chickens is part of that philosophy. Grass-fed beef, range-raised beef, things like this are all parts of this. So if you're a consumer and you want to eat meat, but you don't want to get it from the big industrial sources, there are places to go get it. But that's still a very, very small fraction of the overall amount of meat that people are eating. So the animal welfare folks worry a lot about this and are saying that we have to pay attention to what's going on with animals. So back to the idea of farms. There are some farmers who raise chickens and sell eggs, and these are the kind of conditions. You know, the animals can wander free, they can go in and out of the house. It's not crowded conditions. You know, this looks like the way you think chickens could be raised and are kind of the childhood image that we get from storybooks about what a farm is like. But that's only a small amount of the chicken that people eat. Now, a farmer in these circumstances obviously cares about the welfare of the birds and is providing these kind of conditions. But it's more typical to see this kind of thing. And these are called factory farms, and these cages are called battery cages, where the chickens are confined. They're typically not let out of the cages, and it breeds a whole lot of interesting behavior in the chickens. Now, the animal rights activists have been very visible and important players in the scene in terms of our thinking about food. And I'm going to provide some information from them, and including a video interview that's interesting on this. But the people who are opposed to the people who are opposed to the way animals are raised, that is, the ones who say that this is alarmist, these people are all a bunch of nuts and we shouldn't really listen to them, raised some of the following points in their opposition to the animal rights activists. First, they've said that there's nothing wrong with eating meats. Humans are made to eat meats. And it's been true all throughout human history, and so why would it be bad now? They say that it's the natural order of things, that big fish eat small fish. Tigers eat other animals in their conditions, and the fact that humans eat meat is part of this natural food chain that occurs, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's all natural. They make the case, and not all, but some of them make the case that humans have more rights than animals do here, and it's part of the food chain thing. That much good comes from using animals. That is, human subsistence is a social good here. And there are many people who make their livelihood from raising animals, and many people who are in the economic chain that supports that. They say the liberal views have gone way too far on this. And then there's, as usual, what happens when one group is opposed to another, they tend to vilify the people. They can vilify the ideas, and that's all that, but then you can vilify the people as well. And so the characterization of these people as out of control, hysterical, crazy, is quite common from that point of view. Now, the people who are the activists on this have a number of things that are out there and available. And there's one particular video clip that how many of you have seen the Matrix thing? Okay, just a minority of you, but still a fair number. So this was put out by an animal rights groups, and so one has to factor that in as you see it. But it's a little, it's a takeoff on something you'll recognize. Okay.
Hello, Leo.
Leo. Who are you? How did you know my name? I am Morpheus, and I know a lot about you. Have you heard of the Matrix? The Matrix? Do you want to know what it is? Okay. The Matrix is all around you. It is the story we tell ourselves about where meat and animal products come from. This family farm is a fantasy. Take the blue pill and stay here in the fantasy. Take the red pill and I'll show you the truth. Welcome to the real world. Wow! What is this horrible place? This is a factory farm, Leo. Places like this are where most eggs, milk, and meat come from. How did this happen? I'll show you. In the mid-20th century, greedy agriculture corporations began modifying sustainable family farming to maximize their profits at great cost to both humans and animals. Factory farming was born. Animals are practiced closely together as possible. Most never see sunlight, touch ground, or get fresh air. Many can't even turn around. These cruel conditions cause fights and disease amongst the animals. To fix this, the corporate machine began systematic mutilations, practices such as eating chickens. And they started adding a constant dosage of antibiotics to their feed, just to keep these poor wretches alive. This overuse of antibiotics breeds super strains of resistant disease-causing germs. Every day we get closer to an epidemic that cannot be stopped. What's that smell? 12 million pounds of excrement. This pollutes the air and groundwater. That's why communities near factory farms often suffer from high levels of related sicknesses. Well, it smells like And what's more, factory farming corporations have been destroying communities and mistreating their workers for decades. Since 1950, over 2 million small hog farms have disappeared. If they continue at this rate, there'll be no real independent family farms left. That is the Matrix, Leo. The lie we tell ourselves about where our food comes from. But it's not too late. There is a resistance. Count me in! So how do we stop the Morpheus? We are going to spread the word, but it's you, the consumer, who has the real power. Don't support the factory farming machine. There's a world of alternatives. Click here, and I'll show you what you can do to escape the Matrix.
So again, that is alarming or alarmist, depending on your point of view. It presents the point of view of the animal welfare and the vitality of family farms, but it ignores the potential upside about having more meat available to the population at lower cost. So everybody has their own calculus about how they weigh these sort of things out, but that's one point of view by the animal activists. Another person who's written about this a lot is a philosopher at Princeton named Peter Singer. Now he writes about this in a very interesting way because he brings in history to it, he brings in philosophy, and he's a very thoughtful scholar. And he's professor, as I said, of bioethics at Princeton. He's a well-respected scholar in the field and published a book first in 1975, but subsequently in other editions called Animal Liberation. And you see the book here. And he makes interesting arguments about this, and I'd like to share some of the core of what he says. First he says, and this is readily admitted by the people who believe that the animal activists have gone too far, that humans engage in strong and selective speciesism. So there are some species we feel that it's okay to treat certain ways and other species that we don't. But that equality across species is not a goal, and that this has a long history. It's not peculiar to the United States, and not even peculiar to modern times, but goes way back and has its roots in Western civilization as far back as the Greeks, and with references in the Bible and things. And this has helped form the mindset or the contextual set of conditions under which we operate in terms of the treatment of animals. So, as you might guess, he's one of the people that favors more humane treatment of animals. But his discussion of the history of this is really very interesting. He and others have talked about how children learn early in life about a vision of the farm, and we made mention of this before, and the treatment of animals that is really quite distinct from the reality of it. But you see here this little nursery rhyme and what it means in terms of animals, and there are lots of other things like this that are built into childhood stories that give us some sense of how we treat things. And so at the same time, children are being trained to eat foods like this, and are being, the typical child in America is being raised on a diet that has a fair amount of meat in it. And so they're doing this, but at the same time they're taught that this is where the meat comes from. And it's the difference between the romantic view and the reality of the situation. Now, what is the reality of the situation? Well, there's a great variety, as I said before. There are farmers who raise animals in quite humane conditions, and they care a lot about the animals. There are lots of very touching stories about people who've grown up on the farms and become very attached to the animals, and it's all considered the cycle of life, if you will, and a closeness between the farmers, the animals, the land, and it all fits together into this sort of holistic picture. And some of those farmers, at risk to their own livelihoods, are raising animals under sustainable conditions and more humane conditions. So that does exist, but it's a relatively small amount of the overall meat picture. And if we're considering the big picture where most of the meat comes from, then we have to take these things into account. So Singer and others have talked about how the ignorance gets reinforced, that we're not taught to look behind the veneer of what goes on in farms, and it gets reinforced through literature, religion, the media, and education. And so Singer says that we harm animals for trivial reasons, that we really don't need to be doing this, and that if we cared about animals and weren't engaging in this speciesism, that we would eat less meat, argue for more humane treatment of animals, and really try to change the picture that's occurring in some parts of the agriculture world. So the internet is filled, books and things are filled, websites of the activism groups are filled with pictures like this that give you a sense of the conditions under which some of the animals are raised. In this case, you see a pig confined in very small quarters. As the Matrix little video said, there's a question about whether these animals ever actually see the light of day, or how often they leave the confines of these kind of conditions. The battery cage, here's a picture from Australia of a typical battery cage. In this case, So there were 7 hens in this cage, which measured 18 inches by 18 inches. This is from a book called Animal Factories, and the heading on the little caption there, if you can't read it, says, after their confinement during pregnancy, sows are often immobilized from the time they give birth until the piglets are weaned. This is a picture of a calf confined to a very small space, and you'll see more about this in a video I'll show in a moment, being raised for veal. And it says this veal calf will spend its whole life constrained to this pen so that its anemic muscles will remain tender when butchered. In order to lie down, such calves must hunch up to fit their legs into the 22-inch stall. Here would be an example of a production line from a large chicken plant and how many animals get processed in the context of this. So again, if you think about how many chickens the country is eating, you know, and it shows up in the chicken nuggets, it shows up in KFC, but also in the whole chickens people buy and cook at home and things like that. It's a really vast industry, and a large chicken plant, like let's say a Tyson chicken plant that might, the largest chicken producer that might exist in Arkansas, can process an unbelievable amount of chickens in a relatively short period of time. Some of this has been written about by this professor who I've heard speak several times, who's in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Arkansas, Steve Striffler. He's a very interesting guy, and he's done his research, his field work, by more or less going undercover and working in the plants. So he wanted to write about the labor conditions in the banana plantations in South America. He speaks fluent Spanish, so he basically masqueraded as a worker and went down there and worked in the banana plantation and wrote about the experience from the inside in a book called The Banana Wars. And then he did the same thing by working in the chicken plant in Arkansas. And he noted that in this area, in Arkansas raises vast numbers of chickens. And in the context of these communities, there are a lot of people who have come, some illegally and some not, from South American and Central American countries. And so a lot of people who work in these plants don't speak English, but only speak Spanish. As I said, he speaks Spanish. So he would get in there, and I think one of the jobs he took on in one of these plants was he was the flour handler for breaded chicken parts or something, and his job was to carry big sacks of flours, open them up, put them in the machine that did the breading of the chicken parts and stuff. But he really understands the industry. So this particular book that's just called Chicken is really very interesting. I met him, by the way, at a conference that was put on by the Agrarian Studies program here at Yale several years ago. And the conference was called The Chicken. And I've never been to such a conference on something like the chicken, but it turned out to be very interesting. And there were people like him there. Michael Pollan spoke at the conference. And there were a lot of interesting things about the role chicken has played in literature and history. And in fact, if you think about a lot of the colloquialisms and sayings that we have, a lot of them have to do with chickens, like, you know, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. You know, why did the chicken cross the road? Running around like a chicken with its head cut off. There are all these sort of things in modern language that have to do with a chicken that I wasn't sort of aware of until I went to this conference. But this book by Striffler is really pretty interesting. Another person who's achieved some visibility in this whole debate is a man named John Robbins, and you see a picture of him there. He's an interesting fellow. He was born in 1947 to Irma and Irv Robbins. And Irv Robbins, you may not recognize the name, but was the Baskin Robbins, the Robbins of the Baskin and Robbins. The John Robbins, instead of getting into the family fortune and business, broke off because of his concerns about agriculture, food, nutrition, and animal conditions and things. So he's an interesting person, and I'm going to show you a little video clip in which he's featured, not so much because it's the most prominent thing out there, or not so much because he has a more credible voice than anybody else, but I do think it's representative of the animal concerns thing. He's also written a book that achieved some notoriety and a film that was based on that book called Diet for New America. So if you'd like to read more about him, you'll see it there. So here's this interview.
For most of the year, they graze on the hillside.
I realized that my pictures of farm animals had come from childhood.
This is a dairy cow and her young calf.
Those peaceful pictures of contented cows.
Babies eat plenty of rich grass.
In real life, I learned there is a strong bond between a newborn calf and its mother. Other cows always seem to show a strong interest in a new calf.
But it's a good, healthy baby bull.
Dairyman John Schoeneveld was proud to show me the newest addition to his herd.
Unfortunately, it's a bull. If it was a heifer, I would keep it.
Will he be allowed to nurse?
Oh yes. Oh yes, he will be allowed to nurse. He will stay with his mother tonight, and then tomorrow morning he will be picked up by a broker, which takes him to a place where they raise him.
Are they raised, some of them for veal?
Yes, some are raised for veal.
If a calf born at a dairy is a male, he will often be taken from his mother within a day. Some will be chained at the neck and will live in a cramped space for the remainder of their short lives.
It is the ultimate. There is none finer. It's tender, delicious, succulent. You can almost cut it with your fork. Here is an incredibly popular dish in the finer restaurants. It's called osso buco. It's the veal shank. They raise the animal in a very special way so that you have this incredible delicacy.
If an animal is seldom allowed to move, its muscles remain weak and soft.
The muscles of the animal are tender, very tasty. Notice the pale white color, the milky fat.
We pay extra for it. We pay a premium price for it because we're taught to believe that lighter meats are healthier. Pigs have always been the favorite animal of mine. They're playful, sensitive, and affectionate. They have a close family life, and in some ways they're actually more intelligent than dogs. I used to think that pigs were still raised like this, outdoors, in a pleasant barnyard. But this farm, photographed 40 years ago, is a historical relic. Hogs are raised very differently now. To be competitive, farmers have to crowd the maximum number of animals into the smallest possible space. And there they live their whole lives. Pigs have strong natural instincts: rooting, nest building, caring for their young. But in confinement, these strong drives are blocked. And as a concerned citizen, someone who wants my life to be a statement of compassion and some respect for the world, when I see what's done to the animals, it makes me look at my food choices in a whole new way. I have to question, is this what I want my contribution to the world to involve? Today's chickens aren't in barnyards anymore. They aren't scratching around on the earth and pecking away and looking up at the sun and doing the things that chickens have done for millions of years. The layer hens are kept crammed into these cages so tightly they can't even lift a wing. These are birds that have a strong territorial impulse. And so they have a pecking order normally, which they create by spatially orienting themselves. But they can't do that because they're crammed together so tightly. So the result is their instinct causes them to peck at each other constantly. Now, The industry responds to this by cutting off parts of their beaks. It's called debeaking. It's standard operating procedure in the industry today. And the only result of that is they continue to peck, but they can't kill each other in the process.
The poultry industry is a good example where we may have a building that has 100 or 200,000 chickens that are very closely put together. Now, the people who raise the chickens are basically economic creatures. They are responding to the market demand for cheap chicken. And I think that traditionally the humane aspect really didn't even enter the equation. I think the idea was to produce chicken cheaply.
Now, one of the other ways that the industry responds to the overcrowding and the stress and the birds' reactions to it is by feeding them antibiotics.
Well, in a chicken house where you have 200,000 birds, an outbreak of a disease can kill all the birds in a very short period of time. Therefore, you need biosecurity. You need to make sure that the animals have antibiotics to fend off even the smallest infection.
The antibiotics that are fed to livestock are very potent drugs, and residues of these substances are frequently found in meats and dairy products. No one is certain as to the effect that these drugs have in the human body, but it's a very worrisome thing to consider when you sit down and have your lunch.
There's an acceptable level that's set by the federal government, and I assume that this is all right. The problem is you have some people who are irresponsible, and they use the drugs indiscriminately, many times not under veterinary supervision, and then we find huge residue levels.
And if the chickens have been poisoned, and if the chickens have been treated so obscenely, then what is it that we're doing to ourselves in the process?
Now, in that little video clip, you saw the extremes. You saw the industry spokesperson saying that, well, everything's safe as far as we know, and we're following government standards, except for a few rogue people who use too much of the antibiotics. You have the physician saying we don't really know what the consequences of this are, and then you have Robbins, and the two most important extremes I think was around that case of veal, where you have Robbins saying that my statement about the way I live my life doesn't allow me to eat something that comes from an animal that's been treated that way. And then you have the chef in this almost euphoric language talking about the rare delicacy that the veal provides for us, and that the animal has been raised in a very special way. So you see really the differences of opinion on that kind of thing. So if we want to summarize what there is about animal welfare in this discussion, it touches many sensitive issues. People care a lot about this. The imagery that gets used in the matrix, and I could have shown you things that are a lot more disturbing than what I have here, and they're readily available on the internet about animal treatment. It evokes very visceral reactions to people. It evokes emotional reactions. It has economic consequences. A lot of things are tied up in this discussion of animal welfare. And again, if you look at the way Singer has written about it, it goes way back in human history. It has philosophical, social, historical roots. And so it's complicated ground. There's no question about it. But for many years, nobody wanted to tread the complicated ground, or people weren't even thinking about the fact that there was complicated ground. Now at least people are focusing on it to some extent. And books like Fast Food Nation, which talks about how animals are raised in order to fuel the fast food industry, help bring some attention to this. So there's still far to go and a lot of thinking to be done on this, but it's a very interesting issue. And so when we talk about whether modern agriculture is sustainable, one of we have to ask, is it environmentally sustainable? Is it culturally sustainable? But also, is it morally sustainable? And that's where issues like animal welfare come into being. Let's talk about shrinking biodiversity. This is a really interesting issue. Here are some examples of how the number of varieties of crops in the US and around the world has really changed, and you can see the numbers yourselves. But at one point there were many, many varieties of foods in the environment. People grow different strains of things right near each other, and now that's really been reduced a lot. So here's a map showing the crop distribution around the country. And if you look at some of the Midwestern states, the yellow segments there represent parts of states that are soybean and corn growers. And as you can see, there's that big pocket through the Midwest where basically those are the only two things grown. And then wheat would be true in other places like Kansas. And so and then as farmers shrink the number of varieties that they grow in order to select the varieties that have the most important market properties for them, the biodiversity shrinks as well. Is this a concern? Well, again, if we think about Iowa, 92% of the farm acres in Iowa are corn or soybeans. And so Iowa, which is an incredibly fertile part of the country, you have to import a lot of the food that's actually eaten in Iowa because it's basically the raw stuff that's grown, the corn and the soybeans, and shipped elsewhere. Let's talk about orange juice. There was a graduate student at Yale in the School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences named Melissa Hamilton, who spoke to me as she was planning her dissertation, which she's now completed and will be published as a book by Yale Press in 2009 about orange juice. And I was fascinated to meet with her. I mean, I learned more from her than she learned from me because she knew a lot, of course, about the orange industry. And in the context of her writing and research for the book, she came up with some interesting statistics. So I actually have only seen parts of the book so far, but she was kind enough to share with me some of the early drafts of chapters on this. You know, the orange juice giants, Minute Maid and Tropicana, control a fair amount of the market and are big players, especially because they themselves are owned by bigger companies, Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. And so this is our view of what orange juice is, but it actually has a pretty interesting history. The first American planting of oranges happened by a fellow named Captain D.D. Dummett in Merritt Island, Florida in 1830. Merritt Island is on the east coast of Florida, and a little blow-up of that section of the state looks like this, where Merritt Island is part of this national refuge in this area here that's just north of the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral. And there's a body of water that's part of this called the Indian River, and that's one of the primary names that gets applied to brands. There are landmarks in the development of orange juice. There was a time in the United States when orange juice wasn't even a thing. It wasn't a product, it wasn't a food. People didn't even think of using oranges for that purpose. You ate oranges, but you didn't squeeze them and get juice out of them. Well, the Florida orange growers, because of advances in farming techniques, especially a particular way called budding or grafting that allowed them to have a shorter maturity life for the orange trees, were able to create a surplus of oranges, and they were creating more than the country would buy. And so an important impetus for them was to create new ideas for products that could be derived from oranges, and somebody came up with the idea of orange juice. And then think about the time when it wasn't even a product to the point where now we think it's really the key part of breakfast. And you drink it when you get a cold, and so this idea that it has important medicinal properties and vitamin properties and is to be eaten for breakfast is all part of the marketing of this, because that got started from scratch. There's nothing inherently making it a breakfast product. But also there was the need in World War II for more vitamin C to get to the soldiers, and the concentrate process was patented in 1948. And so that means, because most of the oranges are made for juice, not for eating, but for juice, these are the properties, the physical properties that have become important. And you can breed oranges to have these properties, and this has shrunk the number of strains of Florida oranges. So two particular varieties of oranges, the Hamlin orange and the Valencia orange, put together make up a large share of all the oranges grown in Florida. And so this is an example of shrinking biodiversity. Good for the marketplace, good because the farmers can get more out of the oranges than they might have otherwise, but perhaps not good for biodiversity reasons because the number has shrunk. Another great example of the problem with shrinking biodiversity was the Irish potato famine that happened in the 1840s, very famous case study that you've probably heard about. So there are many, many varieties of potatoes around the world. They came originally from the Andes, and there have been more than 5,000 varieties identified. But only one was adopted in Ireland. Wheat was grown in Ireland at the same time of the famine, but it was exported to England. The staple diet in Ireland was milk and potatoes, but a fungus came about that this particular strain of potatoes was vulnerable to, and it wiped out almost the entire potato crop, leading to vast, vast problems with famine. And 1 million people died in Ireland while wheat was being exported to England because of economic conditions. And so if more varieties of corn, or rather potatoes, had been grown in Ireland at the time, some would have been vulnerable to this fungus, others would not have, and it's quite possible that a famine like this could have been averted. So there are many reasons for shrinking diversity. And you see some of them listed here, but some of it has to do with the physical properties of the food. The Green Revolution has played a part in this, genetic modification has played a part, etc. There is a move afoot to try to reverse this problem. And some of the things that have been done here are ways that some activist groups have tried to counter the shrinking biodiversity. And then the example you may have heard of that has been most prominent recently is called the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in a remote island in Norway. Some of you may have seen the pictures of this place, but it's a vast underground protected environment that where hundreds of seeds are kept of several million crop varieties. So these can then be saved and preserved for later on. Agriculture and pollution is also a very interesting example. There are many types of pollution. Some of these we've alluded to in earlier classes. But the idea that this is the way a farmer takes care of pests is less common than this sort of thing. And there's a lot of concern about the chemicals that are used in these environments. So here's a particular hog farm in Missouri where there are 9 examples of this particular set of hog barns there with almost 9,000 hogs per site, and something has to be done with all that waste. And there's great concern about what that waste does for global warming, as I mentioned earlier, and for groundwater, et cetera. And you generate huge amounts of waste when you have animals in these kind of conditions. So a single 50,000 acre hog farm, one hog farm, can produce more waste than the entire city of Los Angeles. So you see how this is contributing. And so animal waste outnumbers human waste by a factor of 130. The amount of manure then that's produced just by livestock in the U.S. per American citizen, so per you, every citizen here, there's 3 tons of manure generated. The impact on the environment is considerable, and a lot of concern about how the pathogens in these things move through air and water and movement of human beings. Here's some statistics that show just how severe the pollution can be. 90% of US rivers and streams test positive for these things. The average stream tests positive for more than 20 pesticides, and a lot of the animals are affected as well. One study came out about a particular aquifer in Nebraska, and they found that there were many pesticides found in this aquifer at lifetime health advisory levels, and that atrazine, which is the most popular pesticide used, was found in 100% of the samples from this particular aquifer. Okay, so we're just about out of time, and there were 2 more things I wanted to talk about, but I'll spill these things over into the beginning of the next lecture, and we will see you on Monday.